That's Dr. Timothy Kazuo-Staines, lecturer in Gender and Culture Studies at the University of Sydney. And he's right. Asian men don't get as many replies, whereas Asian women do get more, and even express a higher preference for dating someone outside of their racial background. So it's not a thing where all Asians are roughing it, just the males.
And the way that we talk about this in academic work is that it's a form of Orientalism. And Orientalism comes from, I guess, the colonial fantasy of the East, where the West is the kind of superior culture that colonizes and penetrates the East through colonization, and it's a fantasy of power over a lesser race.
Okay, we've touched upon Orientalism a few times, but I think we're going to really need to dive into it for this episode. So, Orientalism is this term coined by Edward Said, a Palestinian-American professor of literature. Like Dr. Staines mentions, it's this view of the East from the perspective of the West. Said noticed that a lot of European scholars would write about the East, but because it's coming from the perspective of the West, who thought they were more civilized and superior, the way they wrote about the East is tinted by the mysterious, uncivilized, exotic, and even dangerous. Knowledge of the East, or the Orient, is formed from this perspective, and it continues to shape how the West sees the East today.
And this particular fantasy, it's a very gendered one because the colonizer is very masculinized, right? Because they are the dominator, the penetrator, as it were, and the Asian is very feminized in that scenario, in that particular power dynamic. And so within that imaginary, white men desiring Asian women reinforces that colonial fantasy. But Asian men become a threat to white men, and therefore they need to be constructed as asexual or homosexual or whatever it might be in order to make sure that they are not competition for women for white men. And so that's meant to be the colonial hangover of those kind of racialized gender dynamics that affect Asian men today, because all of those assumptions about the threat that Asian men signify to white men is all in our mainstream culture.
So because of the way Asia is painted by the West, Asian men get portrayed in a way that robs them of their Western masculinity.
The way that white colonists saw Chinese migrants is in a really emasculated way right from the beginning. So often they would talk about Chinese migrants coming in these big groups.
That's Dr. Sophie Loy-Wilson again, senior lecturer in Australian history from the University of Sydney.
Images that colonists painted of these migrants depicted them in a uniform way. They were all dressed the same, looked the same, wore the same hat. There was not much individualization happening. So they're described as these kind of slave-like hordes of people coming from China. In reality, they were often individual miners who'd come on like individual contracts to work in the mines.
So instead of Asian men having individual personality and traits, the view of them is almost homogenous because they're seen as so foreign and other. And Dr. Loy-Wilson says the vast majority of Chinese migrants were men. So if that's the way they're depicted, what were these men actually like?
When I was first introduced to this field, the way that I saw Chinese men depicted in cartoons was as effeminate, sinister, like really Orientalist stereotypes are deployed, often kind of devoid of gender almost, never painted attractively, never painted with strength. When I began to see photographs of Chinese miners or laborers from this period, and I mean from like the late 19th century or even a bit earlier, I'm looking at men that were incredibly strong, incredibly tough to survive in any of these jobs, whether you were doing the early kinds of, quote unquote, coolie labor that some men were involved in, whether you were a shepherd, whether you were a gold miner. This is hard labor. You had also come from a part of China where if you are working in the agricultural sector, you are carrying liters and liters of water on your shoulder every day just to survive in the village. You are in the fields, farming. So these are very, very strong people, women and men, right? And I feel like that physical strength was never captured in the images that I saw, whether they were paintings or whether they were cartoons. That kind of physical strength was stripped away.
So early on in our history, Asian men are depicted as effeminate because they're almost this unknown common enemy, despite being strong, rough men. and racial violence is a real threat to them.
So the amount of articles we have of market gardeners being beaten up and killed, Chinese men being beaten up and killed, I mean, this is a weekly, regular occurrence that Chinese men are attacked by gangs of larrikin youth. So suddenly you have a really nasty, situation. Then, boom, you have Federation 1901. So right when our nation is formulating its identity, this deep undercurrent of really confronting racial violence is part and parcel of city life. And this racial violence is particularly targeting Chinese men.